want to welcome to the program the Public Affairs Director from Democracy Fund, former senior aide to Senator Harry Reid, the author of Kill Switch, The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy. Adam Jentleson, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So Adam, I'm very excited to have you here, in particular on this day, and to some extent, I think what we anticipated when we booked you has changed just a little bit. But I want to talk about the filibuster and what you've written in the book and the history of the filibuster. It's fascinating. There was stuff in there, as much as I've been sort of decrying the filibuster for years, there was stuff in there I did not quite realize, and I found it a great read. And then obviously I want to talk about the report today that Joe Biden is going to supposedly eschew a reconciliation and try and get a bipartisan deal. But let's talk about this history of the filibuster. You basically break it down into two different eras. The first essentially coming from more or less around Reconstruction through to the Civil Rights Act. And give us a little bit of history of this. What I found amazing that I found from your book was that every deployment of the filibuster during that time, that some 80 years, I guess it was, more was to stop civil rights legislation.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we know, we have a vague sense that the filibuster was associated with segregation, with efforts to stop civil rights. President Obama has called it a relic of the Jim Crow era. But, that's not just an association. That was its primary and exclusive purpose. It was, dating back to the beginning of the Senate, the filibuster was not part of the original Senate. The founders did not include it in the Senate. The Senate was a majority rule body and obstruction was looked down upon in the original Senate. And it was only after the intervention of John Calhoun in the middle of the 19th century that the filibuster really began to come into existence as we know it today. But it wasn't until the 20th century that the filibuster could be applied in the way we know it today, where it is used to raise the threshold to pass a bill from a simple majority to a supermajority. And the way it became honed in this method was by being used to block every civil rights bill that came before Congress from the end of Reconstruction in 1877 all the way through 1964, when Lyndon Johnson finally broke a Southern filibuster. So this wasn't incidental to the filibuster. This was how it was used. This was how Southern senators brought it into existence, and it became a normal part of Senate life because civil rights and the continued oppression of Black Americans was the only issue that provided enough motivation for senators to make this massive innovation and change the shape of the Senate.
I mean, this is, that was, and I want you to just talk a little bit about John Calhoun, because I think, we've some time ago, I guess now it was, we had Nancy McClain on to talk about democracy and change, which covers a lot about John Calhoun, but give us a sense of who this guy was and the context in which, because your book is The Crippling of American Democracy. And on some level, it was pretty lame. There was a certain, there was a lameness to the democracy as it, when it started, particularly when we're talking about the Senate, right? I mean, this is a the democratic body.
That's right. I mean, the Senate has always been an anti-democratic body. But I think the thing about that is that that's often used to overlook the fact that it was more democratic in its original conception than what it has become today. Even as a very deeply anti-democratic body, it was never supposed to be as anti-democratic as it is today. And John Calhoun was the originator of the trend that brought us to where we are today. James Madison, who's often cited as sort of the leading protector of minority rights among the founding fathers, never intended the Senate to have a filibuster, and he certainly never intended the Senate to have a supermajority threshold that almost every bill had to clear. The person who wanted it to be that way was John Calhoun. And so Calhoun was in the Senate starting in the 1830s. This was around the time Madison passed away. All of the other framers were dead. And Calhoun started to innovate the filibuster. He used it exclusively to advance the interest of slavery and to protect the planter class, who were his main benefactors as a senator from South Carolina. So he created the Senate where a minority could have a veto over everything the majority wanted to do. And he was explicit about this. He wrote a tract called A Disquisition on Government that was published right after he died. And he said that he didn't think the framers put in enough protections, and Calhoun wanted any minority faction in the country to be able to exercise veto over anything that passed. So the Senate basically for 200 years was caught in a battle between the Madisonian vision, where there was a lot of debate, but eventually a majority would have its way, and the Calhounian vision, where a minority could block anything that passed. It took about 200 years, but part of what the book argues is that Calhoun won. The Senate we see today, McConnell's Senate, is a Senate where a minority of 41 senators who can represent as little as 11% of the population can exercise veto power and block anything the majority wants to do. That is the culmination of John Calhoun's vision of the Senate.
We should be clear here that when we talk about a minority, particularly in the context of Calhoun, but really, I mean, until this day, the minority that we're talking about in blocking these things is really, I mean, the functionally the aristocracy, or at least the moneyed elite in this country, right? I mean, it's the moneyed, it's the powerful, it's those people who, the few who are ruling the many, and it is, and the idea of extending, I guess, American democracy to non-white people was sort of like the, I guess, the tip of the spear, as it were, in terms of like opening up and democratizing our country.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, we should be careful with our terminology here. When I say minority, I'm talking about minority in the sense of the top 1%. This is not about protecting vulnerable racial or ethnic minorities. You know, Calhoun, the great American historian Richard Hofstadter, called Calhoun the Marx of the master class. So Calhoun only deployed minority protections to protect the overdog, not the underdog. And what he saw was that this minority was losing out. You know, he was operating at a time when it was becoming increasingly obvious that America wanted to move away from slavery. They weren't, you know, incredibly enlightened, but the Northern economic model was proving dominant. Even, you know, in the antebellum times, there was a prevailing sense that slavery was a necessary evil. A lot of the argument that they made was that slavery was bad for white people because it debased them and taught them bad habits. So, you know, we're not exactly talking, you know, enlightened thought here, but nonetheless, slavery was losing out, and the slaveholding class was a minority. Calhoun needed to find a way to increase the protections and the power of the minority within our system of government. And in order to protect, you know, the planter class, the elite, the wealthy, and preserve the oppression of Black Americans, that is why he invented the filibuster.
So let's talk about the second era, I guess, of the filibuster, where sort of the that game that you just described on some level, that dynamic, is sort of blown apart by the Civil Rights Act. And we move into sort of like phase two of trying to maintain that power by the elite, essentially, in a new era. Characterize that era for us.
Yeah, so this is fascinating. So, you know, much has been written about 1964 when Lyndon Johnson, as president, finally broke a Southern filibuster against civil rights. Now, to be clear, this was not the first time a civil rights bill had come before Congress. There were many civil rights bills that had come before Congress, like we talked about in the previous 80 years. This was the first time that they were finally able to break a Southern filibuster. Now, at the time, people thought maybe this is the end of the filibuster. Maybe the way that people saw it being used against civil rights will cause it to go away. Its association with segregation, its association with white supremacy will make it something senators don't want to use. But what happened against expectations was the opposite. It lost its association with segregation. It became sanitized and sort of entered the market like a generic drug. And when it entered the market, it found that demand was high because senators saw how powerful it had been against civil rights. And, you know, their issue might have been something else. It wasn't blocking civil rights. It was, you know, agriculture policy. But they knew that they could take the filibuster and wield it and create leverage for themselves in the same way the South had used it against civil rights. At the same time, a bunch of unintentional reforms started to make it much easier to use the filibuster. Before 1964, you had to use the filibuster in sort of the Jimmy Stewart style. You had to go to the floor. You had to actually physically be there, speak. You often coordinated with a bunch of other senators, and you could hold and you could block. You could hold the floor and block a bill for as long as you had the stamina to actually be there and talk. And this still had some connection to the Senate, the idea of debate, trying to make your case. Still some connection to the idea of the Senate. After the 60s, a bunch of innovations happened. I won't get too deep in the weeds about what they are, but basically they gave every senator the power to wage a filibuster, to raise the threshold for passing a bill from a majority to a supermajority by sending an email or making a phone call before the days of email. All they had to do was signal to the cloakroom and signal to the majority leader that they were going to wage a filibuster against a bill. And the Senate's workload was growing so much by this point, the expansion of the federal government caused the Senate to have a lot more to do, that the majority leaders, if they were warned that there was going to be a filibuster, they wouldn't bring the bill to the floor. And so it became much more user-friendly. And so the point where we're at today is that not only do senators not have to actually go to the floor to wage a filibuster, they don't ever have to explain themselves. They can send an email to the cloakroom, and by that one email, the threshold for passing a bill gets raised to 60 votes. We've come to accept that as normal, and that's why it's sort of standardly accepted that it takes 60 votes to pass anything in the Senate, but that is not the way it was meant to be, and it's actually a very recent development of the past few decades that's even the case at all.
And the problem with this dynamic where you can wage a filibuster with the ease of basically, getting a tee time, I guess, at a golf course, is that we just don't have we as in voters, as in constituents, don't have a sense of why certain bills aren't coming to the floor, or, we don't have a clear sense of who's advocating for what. Everything becomes much more opaque.
Right. I'm all for senators being able to delay a bill if they're going to go to the floor and explain themselves to the public. That is in line with Madison's view of the Senate, that if it was supposed to provide a platform for persuasion. So if you were, in the minority, if you were not, if you were outnumbered when a bill came to the floor, you could go there and make your case. And if you could use your powers of persuasion to persuade people to come over to your side, you could win the day. But the point was, when that was over, if debate had been exhausted, the vote should come up and a majority should rule. Right now, we're having senators enable a minority to block everything that passes the Senate without ever having to even explain themselves. And so if they're going to want to block something, they should have to come to the floor. They should have to make their case. If they succeed, great, more power to them. If they fail, then the majority should rule.
Now, I know at the end of your book, you provide some suggestions for reform, but let's just truncate that. Should we get rid of, and at this point, under Harry Reid, I think, you served with him. He got rid of, in face of McConnell's really unprecedented obstruction of cabinet members, of judicial picks. He orchestrated the removal of essentially the filibuster, the killing of the filibuster for judicial picks and for cabinet members. McConnell subsequently did it with Supreme Court picks. Should we get rid of the filibuster for legislation as well? It's obviously it's not something you can do unless you have at least 50 votes if you're Chuck Schumer. But would you recommend that, or should we just return to an era where the filibuster needs to be more mechanical, I guess?
I think that you should have reform that lowers the threshold to a majority. And there's different ways to do it. And Senator Tom Harkin has had a proposal where you sort of ratchet it down over time, where after a certain number of hours of debate, say 5 to 10 hours of debate, the threshold goes down from 60 to 55, then eventually gets down to 50. So I have no problem with, ideas like that keep the Senate to be a place where the minority will always have the ability to make their case and always have time to debate. But what has to happen is, as a standard matter of procedure, any bill that comes to the floor has to be able to arrive at a vote, a simple up or down vote, where it passes or fails. And so there's different ways to get there that I would support, but that has to be the end goal of reform. The reason is, if you flip it around, what you're doing by having a threshold of 60 is you're enabling a minority of as little as 41 senators, who again could represent as little as 11% of the American population. You're giving them the power to block everything. And so the goal of reform has to be to take away the minority's power to block anything the majority wants to do. Because in our era of polarized politics, where one side succeeds by making the other side fail, the minority is not going to be able to resist the temptation to advance their political interests by making the party in power fail.
And in between that is make the minority that is obstructing legislation, make them pay some type of political price in terms of we need to justify this to the other 89% of the country as to why we're stopping this. So no $2,000 checks. Here's how why this is the case, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So, folks, I cannot recommend this book enough to understand the dynamic between what people perceive as sort of dry parliamentary procedure and our actual politics that take place as well as policy. So, all right, let's talk about at this point. Let's talk about the what's going on now. I mean, obviously. We've got impeachment in the House. It may go to the Senate for a conviction. Give me your take on Mitch McConnell's private musings that he is happy about impeachment, which we all just happen to know. Unmute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it's his private musings that made their way into the New York Times. I'm not sure what to make of this. I mean, I'm reminded, in 2016, in February of 2016, there was a very similar story that reported that Republicans were preparing to abandon Trump. And it cited McConnell specifically saying he was planning to drop Trump like a hot rock if Trump won the nomination. So I think that there may be a little bit of reputation rehabilitation going on here. McConnell trying to make clear that he doesn't like Trump. He might also be, this might be a high fastball designed to keep Trump on his best behavior after that video yesterday where Trump came out and said, basically continuing to encourage violence. So this may be an attempt to make sure that Trump quietly leaves office on January 20th. If it's true that McConnell is actively considering voting to remove Trump and presumably bringing along the 17 senators he'd need to do so, I think you have to assume that is because McConnell thinks it is in Republicans' interests to do so. He's been wanting to purge Trump from the party this whole time. I think, what people often forget is that the Tea Party was causing McConnell fits long before Trump even came on the scene. The rise of people like Ted Cruz, of Rand Paul, who McConnell opposed in the Republican primary for Senate in 2010. These people were driving him crazy and forcing his hand and forcing him into a lot of uncomfortable positions before Trump came along. So for a long time, McConnell has wanted to get rid of this wing of the party. I'm not sure that he will follow through, because the reason he has not gone through with this sort of dramatic action in the past is that it would basically trigger a civil war, hopefully only figuratively, among the Republican Party. It may not yet be the case that it is better for Senate Republicans' political prospects to get rid of Trump. But if McConnell goes through with it, I think what we can safely assume is that McConnell has decided that it is in Senate Republicans' political interests to get rid of him.
Yeah, and I think your assessment is that is my sense as well. And we should also say that, McConnell could think it's in the best interest of Republicans, and he could be wrong.
Right.
Like he could miscalculate. And so I guess we'll have a better sense of that within the next 3 or 4 days. Good for Chuck Schumer, who I am generally very critical of, for basically calling McConnell's bluff. We'll see how explicit he does call McConnell's bluff on this, because this is all really about extracting a political price from the Republicans based upon what they do or do not do, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, look, I hope they vote to remove Trump from office. I would love to see him go out that way. But let's not give them too much credit here. We spent 5 years of the Republican Party aiding and abetting Trump as he caused enormous damage to this nation and hurt countless people. So, I hope they finally do the right thing, but it's about 4 years too late.
All right, so let's talk about this. And I think, to a certain extent, I hope this audience at this point has a broad understanding of reconciliation. We're going to have 3 bites at the apple in terms of reconciliation over the next 2 years, because you're only allowed 1 reconciliation bill per fiscal year, and it was not used in this current fiscal year. So there'll be 2 other fiscal years where a reconciliation bill is there. It can only be stuff that deals directly with the budget, and you only need 50 plus 1. Really, I guess 51 votes to pass. But Joe Biden has just announced that he is not going to pursue reconciliation, or at the very least, he's going to pursue a bipartisan bill. Give me your sense of that.
Yeah. So you're right about reconciliation. It does provide a sort of end run around the filibuster. The downside of it is that it has very tight restrictions on what can be included. I think when you talk about economic issues, there's a fair number of things that can be used to move through reconciliation. It does basically exclude any sort of democracy reforms and things like DC statehood, which I think are essential. So it could be used in the beginning to rush something through. It's a long, complicated story. You might end up having to go nuclear anyway if you use reconciliation, because if you run afoul of the rules, you're going to have to use the nuclear option to change them, even if you go through reconciliation. But it's a fine tool, to use as a stopgap while you try to do other things. But I think fundamentally, civil rights, democracy reforms, and DC statehood will probably end up forcing the issue on filibuster reform. As you said, Biden has said he's going to, at first, try to bring a COVID relief package to the floor under regular procedures, not using reconciliation. So that means you need 60 votes, just like we've been talking about here. I guess he's optimistic that he can get those 60 votes. If he can, the things that he's been talking about for the aid package sound great. It sounds robust. It's going to include $2,000 checks. If he can get 60 votes for that, more power to him. What I'm afraid of is that when they don't get 60 votes, that they will water down the package. And if they bring this package to the floor and they're unable to get 60 votes, they're going to face a decision point. And they can either decide to make the package weaker, or they can decide to reform the Senate rules and pass the stronger version of the package on a majority vote. That decision point could come very early on, and I hope the Biden administration doesn't choose to deliver a worse bill and less aid in deference to these antiquated Senate rules with this deeply racist history. I hope that they get rid of those rules, restore the Senate to the way it was supposed to be, and pass the strongest possible aid package for Americans who are really suffering right now.
All right. So you and I share the same aspirations, but I want to get a sense of what you think, how sincere is Joe Biden here? And we should say, as a backdrop to this conversation, and forgive me, I haven't quite matched up the timing, but I know at one point, Harry Reid, when we were looking at the fiscal cliff, I think must be maybe 2010, I think it was, going into there, the Bush tax cuts were sunsetting, and there was essentially advantage and leverage on the Democratic side. Harry Reid wanted to basically call the bluff of the Republicans. The tax cuts were all going to expire, and Democrats could have brought up legislation that said, okay, now we're offering tax cuts. The Bush tax cuts are all gone. Now we're offering tax cuts. Instead, the Obama administration, and from what I understand, the reporting was Joe Biden sort of slid in, undercut Harry Reid's plan, which was essentially undercutting the Democratic leverage, and made a deal with McConnell that essentially allowed them to pay no political price, allowed them to keep a lot of the tax cuts they wanted, did not get the stuff that the Democrats wanted. With that history, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong on it.
Yeah.
What is your sense as to how much did they learn? How much did they want to learn from that? Is Joe Biden sincere, or is he just basically, this is what we have to do, from my education in the 90s, to pretend to, I guess, Chuck Todd, that we're actually going to try and be bipartisan?
Yeah, I mean, that Chuck Todd point is really it for me. I mean, the senators have to decide if they're in office to please Chuck Todd and to get approval from the pundit class, or if they're there to deliver results for the people who sent them into office. I'm not sure where the Biden administration is going to come down yet. I'm not sure that they're sure. I think that they still think, choosing neither is still an option, that they're going to be able to both deliver big results and do it in a bipartisan fashion. And they're welcome to try that, but I think they have to have a plan B that they're ready to shift into very quickly. If cooperation doesn't work, they have to decide that they're there to deliver results and meet the enormous challenges that we face as a country right now. The fiscal cliff example that you bring up still rankles with me. I was there at the time, and I remember, you're right. Reid drove a hard bargain with McConnell. there was a point where McConnell decided he wasn't getting a good enough deal for Reid, so he went to Biden. And I remember standing in Reid's office at the moment the White House gave him the deal that they wanted Reid to cut. It gave away too much for Harry Reid. This was the winter time. There was a roaring fire in his fireplace in his office. He just turned to the side and threw the paper in the fire. So this was like, my final answer is nothing. And I think Democrats have to be willing to take that kind of hard line against Republican obstruction. When Republicans fail to deliver on the things that we need, Democrats have to be ready to take the necessary steps to deliver those results themselves.
Okay, so let's say hope springs eternal. Joe Biden is doing this performatively. He knows that Mitch McConnell's not gonna get the deal that they want and that the American public needs. But I'm going to do this. I'm going to make it. I'm going to placate whoever those voters are in Ohio who want compromise and mythical ones, I would argue. He does that. And so then we're left with this idea of filibuster reform. How willing is it in your mind, and how much power does Joe Biden have to say, A, to Chuck Schumer, hey, look, this is pretty clear what we need here, and you're facing maybe a primary, so you have extra motivation to maybe do this. And I'm going to call Joe Manchin. And like, how much influence does Joe Biden have with Joe Manchin, or how much is it Joe Biden saying like, Joe Manchin's there, I can't do anything, and so I'm going to have to give away the store to Mitch McConnell?
So Joe Biden has an enormous amount of power here, and in some ways a unique amount of power, unique to him, because he has credibility on this issue with someone like Manchin, and look, I look at this from the perspective of whipping votes, which we had to do a lot in the leader's office. And, I get that Manchin is firmly opposed. He's been very clear about that. But, what you're talking about is a whip list of about, 3 to 5 senators. So to me, I look at that and say, that's not a bad place to start. You're not talking about a whip list of 15 to 20 people. So, you can really focus your efforts on the people that you need to persuade. And Joe Biden, with his history of the Senate, everybody knowing that this guy is about as deep as an institutionalist as they come. If he decides that reform is necessary, he is going to have unique credibility to go to someone like Joe Manchin and say, Joe, listen, you know me. I've tried everything. There is no other option here. We have to do reform. And I think that, combined with other, Manchin's issues, I think he's caught up in ideas of Senate history and reform that I think are incorrect. So I think, helping explain the true origins of the filibuster, the fact that this was not the way it was supposed to be, you combine those kinds of appeals with Joe Biden's unique credibility and persuasion. And I think you see a clear path to getting around a yes. It's going to take time. It's not going to happen right away. But if you only have a few senators standing in the way, I think that someone like Joe Biden is going to be able to persuade them if he chooses that that's what he wants to do.
Okay, so Joe Biden has this sort of like Nixon to China ability to talk to a Joe Manchin. When Joe Manchin says no to $2,000 checks, and then he did a quick 180 on that, good for him. But when he says no filibuster, is he doing that? Is it your sense that he's doing that because I'm a deep institutionalist and this is hallowed ground and I don't want to change the filibuster? Or is he doing that because this is going to mean that maybe some bills get pushed through that aren't necessarily comport with what my donors and my sort of class of people want. And I want that filibuster so that we can't go too far.
Yeah, I think
center of the debate as well.
Right. I mean, that's the thing is the irony of this is that if you got rid of the filibuster and enable the Senate to pass things at a majority vote, Joe Manchin will be the most powerful senator in the Senate because you can't get anything passed unless you have his vote. I think that that was not necessarily the case when it was possible that Democrats would control more than 50 seats. But I think now that things have settled where they are and you've got a direct 50-50 split with Vice President Harris breaking the tie, Joe Manchin is empowered by this kind of reform. He can be the deal maker he wants. He can make sure that bills that he's uncomfortable with don't pass. I'm not thrilled about that prospect as a liberal myself, but simply from an analysis of the power dynamics here, a majority rule Senate would put Joe Manchin in the catbird seat and enable him to be a total kingmaker on virtually everything that came to the floor. So I think those are the kind of appeals that over time will hopefully get him to yes.
So, if I understand what you're saying, is when Joe Manchin said months ago, "I would be against the filibuster," he was not contemplating the notion of like, "Wait a second, I'm vote number 50, and I am literally the fulcrum of the Senate, and therefore, I can get the Joe Manchin Stadium in West Virginia is going to look really good."
Yeah, I mean, look, there's ways to get senators to yes. There's a lot more to his legacy than filibuster opposition. The other thing is, the road to reform is paved with senators being on both sides of this issue. I mean, Harry Reid said he would never go nuclear. Chuck Schumer, this is part of it's almost a rite of passage for senators to be on both sides of the issue. McConnell pushed to go nuclear and to deploy the filibuster reform when he was the second ranking member of the Republican Senate in 2005, when the Bush administration was making a hard push to deploy filibuster reform. So basically everybody's been on both sides of the issue. I hear what he's saying, but I don't see that as an insurmountable obstacle.
Okay, so lastly, let me ask you this. This notion, and we touched on it briefly, but this notion of particularly this generation of Democrats that maintain the leadership in this party, their perception of who they must placate, or whose judgment they must be in proper favor. The Beltway media, folks don't remember around here, but David Broder, that type of animal in Washington. That is, and I say David Broder, and people don't necessarily know who I'm talking about in this room, but that's indicative of maybe this is an era that is over. How much of a generational divide do you see within the context of the Senate, within the Democratic Party, about this particular notion of them having to address, I don't know, that we'd say the Chuck Todds, the Ledley Stalls, the Stephanopoulos, or whoever it is?
You have an entire generation of lawmakers coming up who've never spent a Sunday watching the Sunday shows, and that's not, due to their lack of engagement. They're incredibly engaged and informed, but the Sunday shows just don't set the agenda the way they used to. You have a huge generational divide here. And you look, Biden won the nomination, he won the election. But I think that's sort of papering over the fact that the rising generation of progressive lawmakers, they represent the future. This is an inexorable march of demographics, and they're the people who are going to take the lead in the next iteration of the party. So it is incredibly important with these reform conversations for everybody to know that they have an enormous amount of leverage here. Lawmakers have to listen to them, and they should make their voices clear.
Adam Jentleson, the book is Kill Switch, The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy. It's a fascinating read. I think it's incredibly important, particularly with a 50-50 Senate. I mean, these issues are going to dictate, are going to have such an implication for people's lives on a just a material basis. Very important. Thanks so much for coming on. I would love to have you back to talk more as we see how this is going to plays out over the next month or two, actually.
That'd be great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.